Welcome to Perspectives. I'm Setareh. Today we meet a diplomat, scholar, and author who has served 3 American presidents. Ambassador Dennis Ross served as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Director for the Central Region with a focus on Iran. Ambassador Ross's diplomatic skills were instrumental as U.S. negotiator in the Middle East peace process under Presidents George Bush and Bill Clinton, which resulted in 3 agreements in the 1990s. Ambassador Ross has authored several books on the Middle East and the peace process, and most recently on the art of statecraft. He left the White House in December and has rejoined the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We begin our conversation on his role in the Obama administration. What was your role in shaping U.S. policy towards Iran?
Well, I think many people play a role in shaping any policy, but particularly on Iran, I think this was a real team effort. You had people from the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Treasury Department, all working in concert to try to shape an approach, assess the situation, make judgments about what could be done about it, and develop options that collectively we thought were the right ones to recommend to the President, and obviously the President is the one who makes the decisions.
Now, how has the process of decision-making changed as far as the Middle East issues are concerned? You know, what happens in the Middle East is that whenever there's a decision, people say it's the advisors, it's not the President.
The President is always a decision maker. Frequently he wants, if there isn't necessarily a full agreement, he wants to hear what the different perspectives are. He wants to sometimes actually hear that discussed and at times even debated in front of him, but he then makes a decision.
Now, you mentioned that you've worked in Republican administrations and Democratic administrations also. You have been in international relations for decades, and you have served as a broker, as a negotiator, as a go-between when there were conflicts between nation states or people. Now, when you look around the world, there's friction, whether it's in Syria between a ruler and its people, whether it's in the Sudan between 2 nations, or let's say what is happening between Turkey and Armenia as far as unsettled differences. Now, from your experience, what is the tipping point that pulls people back away from the brink of war or the state of war for them to seek reconciliation and peace?
Well, I think the key is whether or not there's the will to seek peace. You know, frequently when you produce what are meaningful processes geared towards trying to negotiate peace, it's because both sides in a conflict decide that the conflict itself is simply too terrible to contemplate, and they then want to take a step back from the edge or from the abyss. When you see a breakdown, it's usually because there isn't that convergence of interest that sees in conflict such a terrible outcome, or there isn't a readiness to make certain kinds of concessions that would make the avoidance of conflict possible. Conflicts take place not simply because there's a difference in objective and there's a difference in attitude. They take place when, you know, 2 sides aren't prepared to accept that the other side might have a legitimacy of a position and isn't prepared to accept the legitimacy of that position.
Now, should an external nation state stimulate this tipping point, or it should be done through internal affairs and resolving the solutions within themselves, within a government?
Well, sometimes, you know, frankly, it varies. There will be times when the internal dynamic is such that, you know, different parties will come to a conclusion that they have to find a way out. There are times when the gaps are so profound that each side decides that they need the help of a mediator, because making concessions to the other without having someone help mediate it is just, for historical reasons, for psychological reasons, for political reasons, it's very difficult to make that kind of an adjustment.
What do you think, Mr. Ambassador, the role of freedom, democracy, and human rights should be in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think these are aspirations that all peoples seek, they all aspire to. These are all values that in many respects I think are universal. So it's not a case that the U.S. is imposing these kinds of values. You look at the upheaval in the Middle East, the upheaval that's been created, the kind of what's known as the Arab Awakening, wasn't created by the United States. It was created entirely internally. What you found was a profound sense of injustice, a perception that regimes were indifferent, a desire to not only have a voice, but to be able to express it. One of the striking things about what's happened in the Middle East is that people see themselves as citizens, not as subjects. As subjects, they were acted upon. As citizens, they have rights. They can make demands. They have expectations. They want to create accountability. They want their governments not to rule, but to govern. And they want them to be accountable to what they think is important. Those represent the same basic values that you're talking about. Freedom, the ability to express yourself freely, the ability to assemble, the ability to have an opinion and not be coerced for having an opinion. So these are, I think, universal values, and they should form an important part of what Americans' foreign policy should be.
And we will come back to the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening, sir, but I wanted to continue with your role and from your experience of what you've seen in different administrations. You have worked with several presidents. Which president do you think would had a more imaginative view and vision of a conflict-free world if you compare President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama?
Well, first of all, I think every president comes in and sees, shall I say, a set of American interests, but also a set of American values. Mm-hmm. There's no president that I ever worked for who didn't want to see a conflict-free world. Every president has that as an objective and on their agenda. And I would say that, you know, in the case of the first President Bush, he saw the end of the Cold War. And he saw that as an opportunity to try to shape a new reality so that war would become a less common feature of the international reality. In the case of President Clinton, I think President Clinton saw, particularly in the Middle East, an opportunity to make peace. He saw leaders who were prepared to take bold decisions. That was an era of what I would call heroic peacemaking, and he lent his efforts to that. I think in the case of President Obama came in at a time when the world in many ways was starved for a sense of hope, a sense of possibility, and he sought to create that. And in some ways I think his own effort at explaining and creating a sense that there was great possibility in its own way may have contributed to what we're seeing take place in the Middle East today.
Talk of war over Iran's nuclear program has escalated in recent weeks, and Israel and the United States have not ruled out military action to keep Tehran from producing a nuclear bomb. Despite the increasingly sharp rhetoric, all sides are expressing hope that a diplomatic solution can be found to solve the crisis. VOA correspondent Meredith Buell has details from Washington.
Israeli warplanes ready for action. Iran launches war games near the Persian Gulf. A battle-ready U.S. aircraft carrier steams near the coast of Iran. Tehran and Tel Aviv charge each other with assassinations. And the International Atomic Energy Agency's latest mission to Tehran is called a failure. Rumblings of war reverberate across the Middle East. In sharp contrast to the escalating tensions, top officials say there is a diplomatic path to avoid a military conflict. Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Salahi says there are two alternatives: engagement or confrontation.
The Islamic Republic of Iran, confident of the peaceful nature of its nuclear program, has always insisted on the first alternative.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta.
There is time and space for diplomacy, but in order for that to happen, Iran has to meet its international obligations.
Analysts say sanctions are beginning to cripple Iran's economy. And recently, the nation's senior nuclear negotiator said Tehran is ready to resume talks. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
This response from the Iranian government is one we've been waiting for. And if we do proceed, it will have to be a sustained effort that can produce results.
Talks last year in Turkey between Western nations and Iran produced no progress. Some analysts doubt any renewed negotiations are likely to succeed. James Dobbins of the RAND Corporation.
They're simply exposed to too much scrutiny, too much press attention, too much media attention, too much political attention for either side to move very much.
Despite Western sanctions, Iran is continuing to pursue its nuclear program, with leaders saying it will not yield to outside pressure. But the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, says Iran has no interest in developing an atomic bomb.
We want to say that we are not in pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we don't see power in the possession of nuclear weapons, and we can break the dependence on nuclear weapons, and God willing, the nation will do this.
Israel and the United States say if diplomacy and sanctions do not work, military action remains an option. That could backfire, says Massachusetts Institute of Technology security expert Jim Walsh.
Following an attack, Iran will definitely decide to pursue a nuclear weapons capability.
Western nations have been following a two-track approach to Iran's nuclear program, intensifying sanctions while leaving the door open for diplomatic efforts.
If I may, sir, I want to turn to Iran. In a recent op-ed in the New York Times, actually in February, you said that diplomacy has a chance to succeed. Europeans have tried that in the past. And you also in Statecraft, you quote the previous administration saying that negotiations do not have a chance to succeed. Why do you think diplomacy has a chance to succeed now?
Well, I do think, again, the context is critical for when you're trying to resolve any kind of conflict. You asked the question before, what produces the circumstances where conflict can be brought to an end? And oftentimes it depends upon where the parties are and how you affect one particular actor's incentives, disincentives, and behavior. I would say in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, its desire to have a nuclear weapons is a very strong desire. Now, it was never going to be induced. This particular Iranian leadership was never going to be induced into giving up its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. But it does create it has its own calculus for what is in Iran's interest. The reason I believe that the circumstances exist today to give diplomacy a chance is that a context has been created where there is real pressure on this Iranian leadership, and it gives them an incentive to find a way out to reduce that pressure.
What is the way out, sir? Is it security guarantees also?
It depends. I think the way out is for them to achieve what they themselves say they want. They say they want civil nuclear power. If their way out is to say they never wanted to pursue nuclear weapons in the first place, the Supreme Leader now says it's sacrilegious to have nuclear weapons. If he wants a way out, the way out is there because Iran can have civil nuclear power. But what they can't have is the ability to translate that into a nuclear weapons capability.
You mentioned the Supreme Leader. Let's think a little bit from their perspective, from Iran's perspective. When they look at what's happening, the demise of Libya, when they look at the problems that Iraq is having, and when they note the survival of North Korea as a rogue state with nuclear weapons, why should they give up their aspirations and their efforts in continuing their nuclear program?
Well, I would say for several reasons. First, if they want to progress, if they don't want to be isolated, if they don't want to pay a terrible economic price, if they actually want to see civil nuclear power and have technological capability that reflects that, they can have that. If, on the other hand, they want to have nuclear weapons, they're going to find the price continues to go up. And under those circumstances, not only do they continue to pay a high price, but they will increase the prospect that actually military force is used against them. None of that is in their interest.
But they have made these types of conflicts a pillar of the regime. They have demonstrations when the anniversaries of the hostage crisis, hostage taking. What would happen to the elite, to the rulers, if they negotiate with the West?
Well, it's a very interesting question because in the article you referred to, I say that the Supreme Leader has made hostility towards the United States a fundamental pillar of the regime. And he may find it difficult to concede anything that would imply that there's less hostility towards the United States. He has to weigh that price and how it relates to his system of rule that he's created versus the price of being prepared to make a concession.
Now, talking about sanctions, how successful do you think the EU ban be on oil when it starts?
I believe it will be quite successful. I believe you're already seeing it be successful now. In the sense that even though they've made a decision that they will not boycott until July 1, and the Iranians are now saying that they're not prepared to sell to the British and the French, In fact, what's happening is other Iranian customers are not buying right now because they want a big discount on the price, and the Iranians are not at this point selling. So I suspect right now that there's a significant amount of Iranian oil that's not on the market, which has contributed to an increase in the price, but it isn't benefiting the Iranians in the process.
Now, you mentioned the possibility of war or the talk of war, this rhetoric, but you also talk about diplomacy.
Yes.
Now, I want to go back to diplomacy. There is a proposed Senate resolution. It is co-sponsored by Senators Graham and Senator Lieberman. And this will shift the red line, America's red line, as far as the nuclear activities of Iran are concerned. Some critics say that this type of rhetoric and this type of resolution will shrink the space for diplomacy for the administration, especially that we are in an election year and President Obama is under pressure. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the Congress always has the right to express itself, and that's the reality of our system. We have a separation of power, however, between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So the executive branch has the ability to engage in diplomacy and in negotiations, and it will make a judgment about the kind of deals that can be struck, if they can be struck. If a deal can be reached, then obviously, if it requires approval by the Senate, then the administration has to be able to explain it. But that's the way our system works. Right now, the negotiations haven't begun yet. When they do begin, just because negotiations begin...
You think they will begin?
Yes, I do. I do think they will begin. The real measure will be, can you achieve something or not? Mm-hmm. I come back to what I said before. I think in the case of the Supreme Leader, he has to make a decision.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned objectives, and you also talk a lot about objectives in statecraft.
Yes.
Now, Iran says that one of the reasons behind the West pushing to negotiate with Iran is to destabilize Iran. And even Vladimir Putin, the Russian Prime Minister, mentioned that in February. Is this the objective of the United States? Is it regime change?
No, it's not. Look, I don't speak for the Obama administration, but the Obama administration, which speaks for itself, has said very clearly the objective is to change the behavior of the regime, not to change the regime itself.
Now, you mentioned war, and after you left the White House, you did an interview with Bloomberg News, and you said that the Iranians should never think that there is reluctance to use the force. What are the chances, do you think, of an attack against Iran?
I think it depends in large measure on whether or not the Iranians take the opportunity of pursuing the diplomacy that's available to them. If they treat the negotiations that will begin as a game, if they think it's just something to try to divide the 5+1, it's something to try to simply deflect pressure, A, it won't deflect pressure, and B, it won't reduce the risk of war, it'll increase the risk of war.
President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are to meet in Washington next week amid global concerns about Iran's nuclear program and possible preemptive action by Israel. VOA senior White House correspondent Dan Robinson has this preview on Monday's meeting.
Potential war between a key U.S. ally and Iran and its regional and global repercussions is a major concern for U.S. President Barack Obama. In his State of the Union address in January, he urged Iranian leaders to change direction, but made clear the United States will defend not only its interests, but those of its allies.
And we will safeguard America's own security against those who threaten our citizens, our friends, and our interests.
Debate has been intense about Iran's nuclear intentions and the risks and repercussions of any preemptive strike. Ephraim Sneh, a former Israeli defense official, spoke recently at the Wilson International Center for Scholars.
They cross the threshold of enrichment to a point that they are in a very short distance from a bomb.
But retired Admiral William Fallon, a former head of the U.S. Central Command, says Iran's actual intentions remain murky.
You know exactly what their intentions are, how far they've gone, whether they would actually, if they had the means, weaponize some nuclear capability, I think remains to be seen.
A succession of U.S. officials have visited Israel, including General Martin Dempsey, the top U.S. military official. All reportedly urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other leaders to allow more time for sanctions against Iran to work. Cullen Call is an associate professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security.
In essence, it's a game of time. The United States is trying to buy time for a diplomatic solution. Some argue the Iranians are trying to buy time to stall, to make more and more nuclear progress.
Other key Israeli officials, including Defense Minister Ehud Barak and President Shimon Peres, have also visited Washington recently to lay the groundwork for Monday's Obama-Netanyahu talks.
The Prime Minister of Israel is coming to the United States for the annual AIPAC conference. What do you think the capabilities of Israel are, and would they consult with the United States? Would they seek the help of the United States if there were any attack against Iran? And what would the United States do? What would you advise the President to do?
First, I think the Israelis make their own decisions. And obviously they view Iran with nuclear weapons as posing an existential threat to Israel. It doesn't listen to anybody else. It'll make its own decisions. If they feel they have to act, they'll act on their own. And they will not seek or require anybody else's help. That said, the United States has a commitment to Israel's security. And obviously a lot would depend upon what develops and what transpires.
What is your take on the rift that everyone is talking about inside the Iranian elite?
Well, there's a basic struggle for power between the Iranian president and the supreme leader. That's not a new reality. There's often been tension between the two because it's built into the nature of the system. What's different this time is that the Iranian president fights back and doesn't just acquiesce. He will find it difficult to succeed in terms of what he wanted, which is to somehow be in a position where he has a strong base, so even after he's no longer president, he can still have major influence and power. Many of those identified with him were disqualified as candidates, so at this point it appears to be a situation where it'll be difficult for him to have that kind of a constituency within their parliament, but we'll see.
Now, does the United States know anything about the capabilities of the IRGC?
Well, I think we know a lot about the capabilities of the IRGC. But they're the ones who are also paying a price as the economy suffers, because they control about a third of the economy right now. So they lose the longer the situation goes on. If there's a conflict, they lose because it's going to be their assets that are destroyed. So they don't have a lot to gain from having the situation get worse.
Let me turn to Syria, Iran's friend. You are in favor of supporting the opposition. Secretary Clinton also has said that she's in favor, or the United States is in favor of supporting the opposition. Now, this is a bit different in what happened in Libya. The opposition does not control any territory. They're divided. They're sending mixed signals also to the people of Syria. What does supporting the opposition mean? Is it arming the opposition?
Well, I think there's several different things that it can mean. In one case, it means, I think, raising the status and the level of recognition of the opposition to make it clear that it has come to embody what is the alternative future for Syria. Now, that's not a simple thing to do for the reasons that you said. They don't control territory at this point. They have to still demonstrate that they are themselves capable of creating the kind of coherence among themselves and the kind of plan that is non-sectarian, that is inclusive. But they have made strides. There's another form of support, and it could involve providing ways to enhance its ability to communicate, not only on the outside but on the inside. Obviously there's another level of support, which would be, do you support providing lethal assistance or not? That's a more complicated question because, again, the level of coherence, particularly the Free Syrian Army, is one that is less clear-cut. It looks to be something that is more ad hoc. You don't really know if you're providing arms who it's going to and how they will be used. Yeah. But it's also difficult not to contemplate the provision of such kind of assistance at a time when the Syrian forces that are controlled by President Assad are simply engaging in unconscionable, indiscriminate fire against defenseless civilians.
Mr. Ambassador, are you worried that this might be a very long conflict because of the friends of Syria? And do we know how Assad is leaving?
So the conflict already has gone on for too long. The longer it goes on and the longer it drags out, the greater the danger it's going to embody. And it's not simply a moral question, it's a practical question that you're going to see less control within Syria itself. You're going to see a greater potential for civil war. You're going to see a greater potential for the neighbors of Syria to become involved. So the longer this drags on, the worse things become.
Is there a post-Assad plan?
Well, I think there needs to be a post-Assad plan. In the first instance, the post-Assad plan needs to be developed by the Syrian National Council.
How do you assess the Obama policy towards Egypt? And isn't this a test for the administration with what happened with the Brotherhood and also with what's happening right now with the military?
Well, I think everybody has to take a step back and realize that the Obama administration and the outside world is not the author of this story. This is something that has been homegrown within Egypt. They're the ones who had an agenda over time. They were the ones who, in a sense, were allowed a kind of free speech within the mosque over time, and nobody else was allowed any of these things. They weren't corrupt. They created, some semblance of social welfare. So they came to embody the appearance, at least, of social justice. Now they're going to have to deliver. Now they're not going to be able to produce in the economy unless they have help from the outside, and they won't have help from the outside unless they live up to their international obligations and unless they maintain a space for ongoing competition. They respect the rights of minorities. They don't criminalize the private sector. They will have to meet certain standards of accountability. But at the end of the day, this is going to be their challenge. The United States and others can be of help in this, but they also have to live up to certain obligations.
They also have to deliver in the country and take care of their people and their
Absolutely.
future and jobs and so forth. You mentioned different challenges. One of the challenges is writing a new constitution.
Yes.
What is the most important thing that you think these countries in transition or these new governments and these framers of these new governments should guarantee in their constitution?
I think the most important thing is that they protect the rights of minorities. Mm-hmm. They respect the free speech and free assembly. They ensure that, in fact, there is an ongoing space for competition. They ensure there's repeatable elections. I mean, if they do that, they don't criminalize the private sector because they're not going to be able to deliver, as you put it. They have to produce jobs. They have to produce housing. I was struck by the fact that one of the interviews with one woman from a very poor section of Cairo was asked, why did she vote for the Muslim Brotherhood? And she said, because they're not corrupt and they'll provide housing.
I would like to ask you also about the Middle East peace. You have been very much involved in that for decades also. What do you think the single most move would be to push this forward? And also I'd like to quote something you recently wrote. In foreign policy, you said that at this stage we have to be thinking about approaches where you can change the realities on the ground. What do you think a single action would be to make this move forward?
I don't know that there is a single action because I think the bigger problem right now is that both publics have completely lost faith and belief in peacemaking. So what you have to do is you have to restore belief in peacemaking, and that will not come from words. That will come from actions. And so if you ask me, I think in the case of the Israelis, if they can show Palestinians that the nature of Israeli control, the nature of Israeli occupation can actually be reduced, can recede, then Palestinians will believe something can change. If Israelis will see that Palestinians actually believe in a two-state outcome, not a two-state outcome where it's a Palestinian state and a binational state, but they accept Israel for what it is, they accept the Jewish character, then I think that Israelis would change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
You're welcome.
Next week, Perspectives will focus on women, the issues they face globally, and the courage that some of them will be honored for here in Washington. Our email is prs@voanews.com. Thanks for being with us.
This is the Voice of America. Take a picture for a world. It was extended.